Dear friends, in a small village in India, there was a girl who had memorized the Quran. However, when this girl passed away and people started to prepare her for burial, something astonishing happened. Her shroud would repeatedly tear and catch fire. There was no source of water in the village cemetery. Seeing all this, the villagers called a great mufti. But when the mufti touched the girl, everyone was shocked. What did the mufti see in that girl? Let's hear the whole story and stay with us till the end to understand this instructive incident. This story is narrated by the friend of the girl who had memorized the Quran. She says, in our neighborhood, this girl named Rubina was the most virtuous and pure character. She was so virtuous that when any woman in our neighborhood passed away, people would call Rubina and ask her to recite the adhan, call to prayer, in the deceased's ear. Seeing this, our hearts would weep tears of blood. This incident was so well known in our neighborhood that even today, it is on the lips of every child. But when the truth came out, all the people in the neighborhood were ashamed. Rubina was always jealous of her sister. Despite being her own sister, she always considered me as her sister. My name is Zainab. I am the same age as Rubina. Rubina was a very good friend of mine. We lived in the same building. There were 4 families living here. Our house had a small path that we hadn't closed off. From there, we would go to each other's houses. My mother and Rubina's mother were very good friends. Rubina was very good. She was very good in both religious and worldly matters. But I don't know what was wrong with the other daughter. My mother used to say that she would also get better with time. Rubina was influenced by her grandmother. Her grandmother was also virtuous and pious. People would ask her to pray. She often said, "Why do people ask me to pray? I am a sinful servant myself. Who knows if I will be in this world tomorrow or not? I can't even solve my own matters, let alone others." One day, Rubina said to me, "I have to tell you something very important. The matter is so big that I don't know how to tell you. This matter must reach the ears of my mother and father." I said, "Why don't you tell them yourself?" She said, "If my sister finds out, I don't know what she will do. Maybe she can find a solution or arrange her marriage and ask her why she is doing such things." Rubina seemed very worried. I said, "Tell me what the matter is." At that moment, her sister came, and Rubina signaled to me that she would tell me later. But in the meantime, my family and I were going to the village for 2 days. I said, "When I come back, tell me comfortably." But when we came back the next day and were still on the way, heading towards our home, we felt a very severe earthquake. We were on the way, so we didn't realize it much. The bus driver stopped the vehicle to the side, and it was a very open road, so we didn't realize how severe the earthquake was. In our hearts, we prayed that nothing bad would happen, but the worst had already happened. Rubina lived in this room, and she was no longer in this world. Her parents were in a very bad state. Their young daughter was no longer in this world, and that too in an accident that caused her to leave this world. This was no small matter. For me, it was as if my own sister was no longer in this world, and everything was in chaos. Red Heart, they quickly took her to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, she seemed to fall into a deep coma. Now she was lying in the hospital, and her father was handling the rest of the matters. They took them to a house, which was the largest house in our neighborhood, and those people also liked Rubina very much. They also had a very large courtyard. They thought that the final rituals would be performed there, such as giving a bath, preparing the deceased for burial, and then taking the funeral procession from there, because their house had been destroyed. But they still wrapped Rubina in a cloth so that no one could see her. Even in her last moments, she wanted to remain in Purda. She always maintained Purda. She didn't have a brother, so she lived normally at home. But when she went out, she strictly followed all the rules of Purda. She died as a result of an accident, and she was a very famous, virtuous, and beloved girl in the entire neighborhood. So everyone wanted to attend her funeral. All the women wanted to attend the funeral. Their house gradually filled with people. We don't know if anyone called the relatives, but many people were coming. I was also busy serving people, giving water to those who came from far away. But now it was time to give the final bath to the deceased. One of Rubina's aunts stepped forward to give the bath. She said that no one else should come. This was also Rubina's last wish. I was surprised how someone who died in an accident at such a young age had the time to make such a will. Anyway, I thought that I couldn't even meet her properly for the last time. I had seen her 2 or 3 days before when I went to my relative's house, and when I came back, all this had happened. I was her friend and like a sister to her, so I should have moved forward, but Ruby was nowhere to be seen. Everyone asked where Ruby was, and her aunt said that her mother had fainted, so Ruby was in the hospital. Because they said that someone had to be in the hospital, and it made sense. They couldn't leave her mother alone in the hospital. We didn't know what her condition was. The deceased was lying on the cot. When they started putting the shroud on, her aunt started screaming and called some women inside. I also went inside. She said, "Look what's happening." When we saw the scene, we were astonished. The shroud was torn. We said that people nowadays have no faith. They gave a torn shroud because shrouds are not cheap anymore. She said, "No, the shroud wasn't torn. It just tore now." Her aunt wouldn't say such a thing without reason. After all, an aunt is like a mother. She was very worried and crying. She said that when they started putting the shroud on, it tore. The matter seemed strange to us. We said that it must have been torn before, or you didn't hold it properly, or the fabric was weak. But the fabric seemed fine, and the shroud's fabric is usually quite heavy and thick. Anyway, they brought another shroud, and we went outside. But after a while, we heard her screaming again. She was screaming again. We asked, "What happened now?" But before she could say anything, we saw the scene. The shroud had caught fire. One side of the shroud was burned, and it was so burned that it couldn't be put on anymore. Red heart, red heart. She said that she was putting on the shroud, but the shroud caught fire. Now her aunt's condition was very bad. She was gasping for breath. It seemed like her blood pressure had either dropped or risen. She looked very scared, but since she was alone there, it was possible that she had made a mistake. However, there was no matchstick around. Actually, it was strange that such a virtuous girl would have her shroud first tear and then catch fire. This was very strange because Rubina was famous throughout the neighborhood for her virtuous character and good nature. So how could this happen? Her aunt's condition worsened. She said that she couldn't do it anymore. Finally, my mother stepped forward, and one of Rubina's aunts also joined us. She said that she would help too. Rubina had already told me about this aunt. She had said that she was not a good woman, spoke ill of her, and wanted to marry her son. But her son was an alcoholic, so my father had refused. But at the moment, this aunt seemed very worried that we brought another shroud because it was getting very late. Time was passing by. We kept bringing shrouds repeatedly. How long does it take to put a shroud on a deceased person? But here, time was just passing by. Another shroud was brought, and this time, what I saw astonished me. I saw with my own eyes that the shroud had torn again. When I removed the cloth from one side, it was perfectly fine. But when I held it from the other side, I was astonished. It was badly torn. Her aunt was still standing with us. It was possible that her aunt had done all this to defame her after her death. But this kept happening repeatedly. We started reciting surahs and taking the name of Allah, hoping that if there was any punishment, it would end. But that didn't happen either. The matter was now beyond our understanding. There was definitely something strange. Why was this happening to Rubina? First her foolishness, then her death, and now these various spectacles. Such cases are very rare to hear and see. No matter how sinful someone is, such things don't happen to them. These are matters that happen after burial. After burial, it is known what will happen to them and what won't. It is rare to hear that such things start happening to the deceased beforehand. When I was very young, my grandmother told me something. She said that when someone leaves this world, they don't realize that they have died. They wander around there. They see their relatives crying and wonder why they are not looking at them. Why don't they hear their voice? They try to hold them, but can't. This is very hard on the deceased. That's why it is said to bury them quickly. And I was seeing all this. I wish she could speak and answer why this was happening. Because now everyone had come to the conclusion that Rubina was not a virtuous girl. She must have done something that caused all this to happen to her. Another shroud was brought. We lived in a small village. The shopkeeper said that this was the last shroud. It was of good fabric. He said he didn't want any money because we had come 3 or 4 times. He had also heard the news. But he said to announce outside that the deceased was ready and to take the funeral procession. But as soon as we turned around, we saw that the shroud had torn again, and it was so torn that we couldn't send the deceased out like that. Now my mother was also scared and said that we should leave. I angrily said, "Where will we go? Our house is also destroyed. I can't leave her in this condition." My mother's face showed surprise and worry. She got angry and said, "Let's go from here, or something will happen to you too." I thought that maybe her aunt had done this deliberately and lied. Then her other aunt did all this. But now I was standing there myself, and I had no reason to defame Rubina. Why would I defame a girl who was my friend and sister? Night fell, and we decided to bury her without a shroud because too much time had passed. Red heart, red heart, red heart, everything was going from bad to worse here, and now questions started arising in my mind. I said, "Rubina, you weren't like this, so why is all this happening to you?" Everyone was saying that it seems this girl is deliberately doing these things. You wear a veil in front of everyone, but who knows what you do later? Maybe you have lovers, and that's why all this is happening. They decided to call the Imam of the big mosque and Mufti Abdul Rahim to come and explain what was happening. Mufti Abdul Rahim, who was very respected, came from the neighboring village. He also knew Rubina and said, "You called me, so let me see what I can do." The deceased was properly covered, and they asked him to pray. He said he would pray and asked everyone to remain silent. When Mufti started praying, his hand touched the deceased, and the cloth covering her face moved aside. When we saw what had happened, we were astonished. Ruby was not there. I sent my brother to the hospital to find out what was going on. He called me from there and said that Ruby was not there, and Rubina's mother was not admitted either. All these punishments were for Ruby. I remembered when Rubina had said that Ruby was doing something very bad, and that it was important to tell our parents, otherwise something bad would happen. I had a glimmer of hope in my heart that I asked, "Why are you using another name?" She said, "I have lost not one, but 2 daughters in this world. Rubina has also left this world, but we sent her to her grandfather's house in the morning, and she was buried there." Ruby had slipped out of our hands. Rubina had told us that she was doing very wrong things, that she was involved with many people, and was doing things that happen in brothels, but she was doing it at home. That night, she was doing the same things. Rubina kept knocking on the door and telling Ruby not to do such dirty things, not to turn this house into a brothel, to stop these actions. But Ruby didn't listen. It was almost morning, and a severe earthquake struck, destroying everything. That Ruby's face had become strange. So we covered her face and lied to save our honor, saying that this was not Ruby but Rubina. We had already buried Rubina's body in the cemetery at her grandmother's house. Now everyone realized that to save the honor of one daughter, they had tarnished the honor of another virtuous daughter, even after she had left this world. People buried Ruby, and Mufti prayed. He said that these punishments were because of Ruby's bad deeds. Dear friends, you saw what happened to a sinful girl. So I urge you to stay away from bad habits. If you found this incident meaningful, please share it with your friends, relatives, and family. And please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for staying with me until the end of the video.